The grass grows where gods once walked.
Lanarkshire, Scotland. A field, nothing more. Sheep graze where the Duke of Hamilton received kings. Wildflowers push through soil that once bore the weight of 200 rooms. The wind moves across emptiness that swallowed 40 million pounds in a single decade of construction. You're standing on the grave of the largest non-royal residence ever built in the Western Hemisphere. And you don't even know it's there. Hamilton Palace. Say the name today, and you'll be met with blank stares. It appears in no guidebooks. No tourist coaches idle at its gates. There are no gates. There is no palace. There is only absence, profound and total, as if the earth itself chose to forget. But forgetting doesn't erase value. If Hamilton Palace stood today, conservative estimates place its worth at $10 billion, not pounds. Dollars, 10 billion. That's more than the restoration cost of Versailles and the Hermitage combined. It's a figure that dwarfs the insurance value of the Louvre's entire collection. We're talking about a structure whose material worth alone, stripped of every painting, every tapestry, every gilded cornice, exceeded the annual GDP of nations. And it's gone. Not damaged, not repurposed, not transformed into a museum or a hotel or luxury flats. Gone. Deliberately. Systematically. Erased with a precision that borders on the surgical. The greatest art collection in private hands outside the Vatican. Ceilings painted by masters whose names still command reverence in Florence and Rome. Staterooms so vast they required their own climate systems, their own gravitational pull in the social universe of empire. A library that held volumes Gutenberg himself had touched, all of it, reduced to landfill and memory between 1921 and 1932. You know the Titanic sank. You know the Library of Alexandria burned. You know Rome fell. These are the touchstones of loss, embedded in collective consciousness, grieved across centuries. But Hamilton Palace? The silence is deafening. This wasn't a palace that collapsed under neglect. It wasn't bombed. It wasn't consumed by fire or revolution or the slow rot of abandonment. It was murdered, intentionally dismantled, piece by piece, and fed to the earth like a sacrifice to forces we're only beginning to understand. $10 billion in rubble. The math doesn't work. The logic fractures. Buildings of this magnitude don't vanish without catastrophe. They become museums, landmarks, symbols. They anchor economies. They survive because survival is profitable, because heritage has currency, because the sheer mass of their cultural gravity makes erasure impossible. And yet, the fourth Duke of Hamilton spent more on this palace than the Crown spent on Windsor in the same period. Architects who'd studied under Robert Adam poured lifetimes into its design. Marble from Carrara, mahogany from Honduras, craftsmen who'd learned their trades in the workshops of St. Petersburg and Paris. This wasn't construction. It was conjuring. An act of will so audacious it bent economics and geography to its vision. For a century and a half, Hamilton Palace stood as proof that private wealth could rival empires, that a single family, through combination of inheritance, marriage, and sheer dynastic momentum, could build something that made monarchs envious. Then, in the space of a decade, it was gone. No blue plaques mark the spot. No foundations remain visible. The very ground has been regraded, replanted, returned to a pastoral innocence that erases even the ghost of foundations. If you didn't know, you'd never suspect. You could walk these fields for hours and never feel the weight of what sleeps beneath. But we know. We have the photographs, yellowed and fragile, showing a building so immense it seems impossible. We have the auction catalogues, thousands of lots that took weeks to sell. We have the witness accounts, the newspaper archives, the architectural drawings rolled and stored in libraries that guard them like scripture. We have the receipts for demolition, and we have questions. Corrosive, multiplying questions that grow more urgent the deeper we look. Questions about coal and subsidence and debt, about titles and entitlements and the mathematics of collapse, about what happens when the bedrock beneath certainty gives way, about why, in an age of preservation and heritage and cultural awakening, a building worth more than some nations was fed to the crusher and buried in silence. The doors stood 30 feet high, bronze and oak, imported from Italy, installed by craftsmen who spent 18 months on the hinges alone. Behind them lay corridors that stretched the length of football fields, drawing rooms that seated 200, a grand staircase that rose through 4 stories of ascending opulence toward a dome that rivaled St. Paul's. We're about to walk through those doors. We step across the threshold, and the world changes temperature. The great hall swallows sound. Black marble, quarried from Belgium, polished to a depth that suggests water rather than stone. Your footsteps echo and die, as if the space itself is consuming the evidence of your presence. The ceiling vaults 40 feet above, coffered and gilded, each panel a miniature canvas of mythological scenes rendered by Italian masters whose names have been lost, but whose brushwork still breathes in the half-light filtering through stained glass windows tall as houses. Cold. That's the first thing everyone mentions. Not the beauty, not the scale, the cold. Marble this dense holds winter in its bones, even in summer. The temperature in the Great Hall remained 15 degrees below the external air year-round, a kind of permanent autumn preserved by stone and physics. Servants wore extra layers when crossing this space. Guests remarked on it in letters, in diaries. The cold was intentional. Intimidation begins with the body. Make them shiver, and they remember where they are. The walls rise in tiers of architectural ambition. First, the marble wainscoting, 8 feet high. Flawless panels, book-matched so the veining creates mirror images of itself. Organic Rorschach tests frozen in metamorphic time. Above that, silk damask in deep crimson imported from Lyon, woven with patterns so intricate they required 16 months per panel to complete. And above that, the paintings begin. Not mere paintings. Proclamations. A Titian here, casual as wallpaper. The Duke barely glanced at it. This wasn't a gallery. This was the entrance, the aperitif before the feast. The Titian depicted Venus in repose, her flesh rendered with that impossible luminosity Titian alone achieved, as if he'd learned to paint light itself rather than its effects. The frame was Carlo Maratta's work, itself worth more than most estates. Gold leaf over carved oak, cherubs and acanthus leaves curling in Baroque ecstasy. But you don't linger. The Great Hall is a transit point, designed to propel you forward, upward, toward the staircase that dominates the eastern wall like a golden waterfall frozen mid-cascade. The Grand Staircase. Numbers lose meaning here. 32 tons of gold leaf. Not gold paint. Not gilt. Actual gold. Hammered into sheets thinner than human skin. Applied by artisans who trained in the workshops of Versailles and brought their techniques north like missionaries carrying sacred flame. Every surface that could be covered was covered. The balustrade, the newel posts, the risers, the decorative panels between steps. Gold on gold on gold, until the eye exhausts itself trying to find relief. Why would anyone do this? It's not a rhetorical question. Stand at the base of this staircase, and the weight of the excess becomes almost nauseating. This is private space, not a cathedral, not a parliament, a home. One family's decision to transmute wealth into spectacle with an aggression that borders on violence. Each step you climb, your hand on a balustrade worth the annual income of 1,000 laborers, you're walking through someone's need to prove something so badly they set economics on fire. The steps are shallow, designed for the slow ascent of women in court dress, trains spreading behind them like secondary staircases of fabric. 14 inches deep, 4 inches high. You climb slowly whether you want to or not. The architecture forces contemplation of its own grandeur. Midway up, a landing extends 10 feet in all directions, and here, positioned with mathematical precision to catch the eye of anyone ascending or descending, hangs Rubens. Daniel in the Lion's Den, 8 feet by 12. The canvas throbs with muscle and terror and divine intervention. Daniel, pale and slight, surrounded by lions rendered with such anatomical precision you can count their ribs, see the intelligence in their eyes, sense the barely restrained violence in every coiled haunch. Rubens painted this in 1615 in Antwerp, during the period when his workshop was producing masterpieces with industrial efficiency. But this one he kept. This one he worked on himself, personally, every inch. The X-rays prove it. No apprentice hands. This is pure Rubens, his brush loaded with pigments ground from lapis and lead, and minerals whose names read like alchemical formulae. The Duke paid £40,000 for it in 1882. £40,000 when the average annual wage was 60. The mathematics of that transaction create their own gravity. Somewhere, someone went hungry so this canvas could hang in a stairwell. You reach the first floor landing, and the space opens into the cross gallery. 230 feet long, 20 feet wide, a corridor that would swallow most London townhouses lengthwise. The floor is parquetry, thousands of pieces of rare woods fitted together in patterns that shift as you walk, geometric flowers blooming and collapsing under your feet. Oak from England, walnut from France, mahogany from the Americas, ebony from Africa. The entire colonial enterprise rendered in wood grain. The walls are a museum's nightmare and a curator's fever dream. Paintings hang 3 deep in places, floor to ceiling, the old aristocratic style of display that values abundance over space. A Van Dyck portrait here, the subject some minor noble whose name no longer matters, but whose lace-collar Van Dyck painted with such delicacy you can see individual threads. Beside it, a Canaletto. Venice rendered in that crystalline light. Canaletto made his signature. Every window distinct, every gondola a separate act of observation. Furniture lines the gallery at intervals. Not seating, artifacts. A cabinet that belonged to Marie Antoinette, rosewood, and ormolu. Its drawers lined with silk, the color of old blood. An escritoire commissioned by Louis XIV. Marquetry depicting pastoral scenes with such 3-dimensional skill that shepherds seem to recede into wooden distances. These aren't reproductions. These are the actual objects removed from Versailles during the Revolution, smuggled into private hands, traded and sold and inherited, until they arrived here in Scotland, in a corridor used primarily by servants moving between wings. The weight of it accumulates. This isn't wealth, this is pathology. Every object screams its provenance, its cost, its rarity. Nothing here exists for comfort or utility. Everything performs. Everything testifies. Walking this gallery is like moving through someone else's argument with mortality. Each purchase a desperate bid to anchor the self in matter too valuable to ignore. Halfway down the cross gallery, a door opens to the state dining room, 60 feet by 40. The table, when fully extended, seated 84. Mahogany so dark it's almost black, harvested from trees older than the Tudors, each plank wide enough that only 4 were needed to span the table's width. The surface reflected like water, polished weekly by staff using techniques that involved crushed pumice and beeswax and hours of circular motion until their shoulders ached. Above, 3 chandeliers, each holding 144 candles. Crystal from Bohemia, cut with such precision that when lit, the refracted light created secondary constellations on the ceiling, mapped to no known sky but beautiful in their artifice. Lighting those chandeliers required 2 footmen and 40 minutes. Cleaning them required a full day and nerves of steel, balanced on scaffolding while handling fragments worth more than your life. The walls are pine, carved floor to ceiling, in Grinling Gibbons style. Not by Gibbons himself, he'd been dead for a century, but by craftsmen who'd studied his techniques with religious devotion. Fruit and flowers and game birds emerging from the wood with such depth they cast real shadows. Trompe-l'oeil, at the level of obsession. Touch them and you expect softness. Give the yield of actual petals. But it's wood. All of it. Dead matter carved into the semblance of life by men whose names nobody recorded. The China service held settings for 200. Sèvres porcelain, commissioned specifically for Hamilton Palace, each piece painted with the family crest, and scenes from Scottish history rendered in miniature on surfaces meant to hold roast beef and potatoes. Using them was an act of casual destruction. Knives scratched the glaze. Hot food crazes the enamel. But they were used regularly. Meals served on museum pieces, wine poured into vessels that belonged in climate-controlled cases, all in the service of hospitality that was really dominance by another name. Through another door, the long gallery extends another impossible distance. Here, the paintings are arranged thematically. Portraits of family members going back 11 generations, each duke staring from his frame with varying degrees of confidence and melancholy. You can track the genetic lineage through noses and chins, see the same weakness appearing in eyes separated by centuries. Some are masterpieces. Ramsay painted the 5th Duke with such psychological acuity, you can diagnose his depression from across the room. Others are competent daubs, evidence that money can commission art but not guarantee it. Between the portraits, landscapes, Scottish scenes primarily, glens and lochs rendered in the Romantic style that made Scotland legible to English sensibilities, but also Italianate fantasies. Claude Lorraine and his followers painting light and ruins and pastoral impossibilities that never existed outside canvas and imagination. The dukes collected these like evidence, proof that beauty could be purchased and hung and owned. The carpet is Aubusson, woven in France in 1780, its pattern a riot of roses and ribbons and colours that have barely faded, despite a century of feet. The wool came from sheep bred specifically for their fine fleece. The dyes were extracted from insects and minerals and plants, using medieval recipes guarded like nuclear codes. 3 weavers went blind completing it. That's documented. 3 sets of eyes sacrificed to thread and pattern and the demands of perfection. At the gallery's end, a door carved from a single piece of oak, its panels depicting the fall of man in relief so detailed you can count the scales on the serpent. Through this door, the Beckford Library. This is where Hamilton Palace stops performing and starts confessing. 20,000 volumes. First editions, illuminated manuscripts, incunabula so rare that their existence in private hands constituted minor scandals in bibliographic circles. Gutenberg Bibles. Plural. A Shakespeare first folio with marginal notes in a hand, scholars argued over for decades, convinced they were seeing Shakespeare's own corrections but never quite proving it. Volumes bound in leather from animals that no longer exist. Dyed colors no longer achievable, tooled by craftsmen whose guild secrets died with them. The smell hits first. Old paper, leather, dust and something else. Something almost organic. The collective exhalation of centuries of wood pulp and ink slowly degrading despite all efforts at preservation. The air tastes thick. Breathing here feels like consuming history. The shelves rise 20 feet, accessible by ladders that roll on brass rails, their wheels worn smooth by decades of use. The wood is walnut, carved with restraint unusual for this palace, simple pilasters and cornices that let the books themselves provide the decoration. And they do. Spines in red Morocco, green calf, blue silk, gold tooling catching the light from windows positioned to illuminate without damaging, a contradiction the architects somehow solved through angles and louvers and an understanding of light's destructive capacity. Tables positioned throughout hold volumes too precious for shelves. Display cases really glass-topped, climate-controlled before such technology existed through sheer architectural ingenuity. Here, a book of hours from the 14th century, its margins alive with grotesques and gold leaf, each page a miniature universe of devotion and artistry. There, a collection of anatomical drawings by Leonardo, studies for dissections he may or may not have performed, the musculature rendered with an understanding that predated modern medicine by centuries. William Beckford assembled this collection. Eccentric, wealthy beyond reason. He built his own palace, Fonthill Abbey, poured fortunes into books and art and architectural fever dreams until the money ran out and he had to sell. The 10th Duke of Hamilton bought it all. Entire library. Brought it north, installed it here in rooms designed to receive it like a bride entering her new home. Beckford collected obsessively, indiscriminately, brilliantly. He wanted everything that was beautiful and rare. He wanted books nobody else could have. He succeeded, then lost everything, and his collection survived him here, in another man's palace, testament to the futility of possession and the immortality of objects over their owners. A desk dominates the room's center. Louis XVI, ormolu-mounted tulip wood, its surface inlaid with scenes of the hunt in exotic woods and ivory. This is where the Duke worked, if work is the word. Correspondence, mostly. Estate management. Letters to London, to Paris, to dealers and agents and aristocrats in the same gilded trap. The desk's drawers still held their contents when the inventory was made. Letters, bills, invitations to events that happened and were forgotten, all the paper trail of lives lived at altitude. The chair is upholstered in needlepoint so fine it resembles painting. Some woman probably, spent months creating this seat cover, her eyes straining in candlelight to push thread through fabric in patterns prescribed by convention. Flowers, naturally. Always flowers. The aristocracy covered everything in gardens it would never work in, pastoral fantasies cushioning backsides that had never known manual labor. From the library, a hidden door, disguised as shelving, opens to the private apartments. Smaller rooms, relatively speaking. The Duchess's bedroom spans only 30 feet by 20. The bed is a Heppel white, mahogany with satinwood inlay, its canopy silk damask faded now to the color of old roses. She died in this bed, the 11th Duchess. Childbed fever, a stupid death, a medieval death, wealth irrelevant against infection. The sheets were burned afterward, as was custom, but the bed remained, was slept in by the next Duchess, and the next, as if death could be ignored through simple reuse. Her dressing table holds silver implements, whose purposes are mysteries now. Button hooks and curling irons and mysterious picks and prods, all hallmarked, all heavy in the hand, all part of the daily ritual of transformation from human to aristocrat. The mirror is Venetian glass, slight imperfections in the surface that warp reflection subtly, making you thinner, taller, more graceful than truth allows. Every glance in this mirror was a lie of refinement. The Duke's chambers adjoin, connected by a door that propriety demanded and privacy ignored. His room is darker, the wood paneling absorbing light, the curtains heavy velvet that turned day to dusk. Masculine, in the vocabulary of the era, which meant somber and stifling and vaguely oppressive, portraits of military ancestors glare from the walls, men in uniforms they may or may not have earned, swords they may or may not have drawn in anger. Inherited valor, displayed like taxidermy. But it's the chapel that breaks you. Hamilton Palace had its own chapel. Of course it did. 200 capacity, vaulted ceilings, stained glass depicting saints and martyrs with the anatomical precision of the Renaissance and the glowing colors of Gothic revival. The altar is Carrara marble, carved in Rome by students of Bernini's students. A genealogy of craft stretching back to genius. And forward to this, a private worship space for a family that could afford to commission God's house as a subsidiary of their own. The pews are oak, each one carved with the family crest, as if even in prayer they needed reminding of who they were. Kneelers upholstered in velvet, cushioning penitent knees from stone floors. Because even submission to the divine deserved comfort when you were a duke. The organ dominates the western wall, 4,000 pipes, ranging from the width of a pencil to the diameter of a tree trunk. German manufacture, installed over 6 months by specialists who spoke no English and communicated through music, tuning and adjusting until the acoustics satisfied requirements only they understood. Playing it required a virtuoso. The family employed one year-round to perform during Sunday services and practice during the week, so the palace was periodically filled with Bach and Handel, rendered by pipes that cost more than villages. Every surface in the chapel is worked, no plain stone. No empty wall. Every inch testifies to something, devotion or wealth, or the indistinguishability of the two. The windows alone, commissioned from Morris & Company, cost what a laborer would earn in 3 lifetimes. They depicted the Stations of the Cross with an emotional intensity that made worship unavoidable. Christ's suffering rendered in glass and light, bleeding color onto stone floors where dukes knelt and prayed for things they already possessed. We've walked through perhaps a fifth of the palace, perhaps less. There are rooms we haven't entered. The music room with its Stradivarius violins in glass cases. The billiard room, with tables sized for giants. The conservatory, glass and iron, tropical plants maintained year-round by gardeners, who managed heat and humidity through furnaces and prayer. The servants' quarters, a palace within the palace, 200 souls living and working in spaces designed to keep them invisible while maintaining the visible in impossible splendor. Every room is an argument. Every object is evidence. This is what wealth looks like when it metastasizes into identity, when having becomes being, when the self is so fragile it requires millions in material proof to feel real. And every room is haunted by the same question. How does all of this end? The Hamilton family didn't just own land. They owned gravity itself, the social physics that kept Scotland coherent. For 5 centuries, the name carried weight that made earls step aside and bishops bow. The Dukes of Hamilton were second only to royalty in Scotland, and in Scotland, that made them functionally untouchable. Premier peers, hereditary keepers of Holyrood House, the men who held the crown at coronations, who signed treaties, who moved through history like they owned it, because in a very real sense, they did. But titles don't pay for gold staircases. This is where the story turns from excess to pathology, from wealth to the desperate mathematics of maintaining wealth when the sources run dry. The 10th Duke inherited the palace in 1852. He also inherited debts that would have crushed merchant families, gambling losses his father accumulated in London clubs, where aristocrats bled fortunes onto card tables with smiles fixed by breeding and desperation. £20,000 lost in a single night at White's. 40,000 dropped at Crockford's over a season. These weren't investments gone wrong. This was aristocratic suicide by leisure, the slow squandering of estates accumulated over centuries, all fed into the maw of boredom and entitlement. The 10th Duke looked at his inheritance and saw a machine requiring constant fuel. The palace alone consumed money like a living thing, heating bills that exceeded the annual budgets of parishes. A staff of 200 drawing wages, requiring housing, food, management. The art collection needed conservation, restoration. The grounds demanded gardeners, groundskeepers, gamekeepers, stable hands. The social obligations, the entertaining, the season in London, the expectations of a duke, all of it churned through capital with mechanical efficiency. And beneath it all, literally, lay salvation. Coal. The Lanarkshire coalfield curved under Hamilton Palace like a dark promise. Geologists had known for decades. The seams ran deep and rich, bituminous coal of exceptional quality, the kind that powered the Industrial Revolution's furnaces and made fortunes for those with the land rights and lack of scruples to extract it. Other estates had done it. Other aristocrats had sunk mines on their lands and watched the royalties pour in like black gold transmuted into actual gold through the alchemy of geology and greed. But there's a reason you don't mine under palaces. The technical term is subsidence. When you remove coal from underground, you're creating voids, empty spaces where solid matter used to exist. The earth above doesn't hover. It settles. It shifts. It collapses. Slowly or suddenly, but always inevitably, following gravity's patient instructions. Buildings on the surface crack, tilt, fail. Foundations shear. Walls separate from their moorings. The ground itself becomes unreliable, a traitor to everything built upon it. Every mining engineer in Britain could have told the Duke this. Many did. Reports exist, filed away in estate archives, technical assessments warning in careful language that mining beneath the palace would constitute slow-motion demolition. The subsidence wouldn't be immediate. It would take years, decades possibly, but it would come. And when it did, no amount of wealth would reverse the physics. The Duke proceeded anyway. In 1882, he leased mining rights to the Hamilton Palace Colliery Company. Not sold, leased. He retained ownership, simply granting permission to extract coal from beneath his own foundation in exchange for royalties calculated per ton. The mathematics were seductive. The coal seam, called the bent sieve locally, ran thick and accessible. Initial estimates suggested 50 years of productive extraction. At market rates, the royalties would generate hundreds of thousands of pounds annually, enough to maintain the palace, enough to settle the debts, enough to continue the charade of limitless wealth for another generation. The mining began a quarter mile from the palace, working its way gradually closer. Standard procedure. You start at a safe distance, extract what's easy, then expand toward the riskier areas as technology and experience allow. But the bent seam didn't respect property boundaries or architectural sensitivities. It ran directly beneath the palace's eastern wing, under the foundations, under the Great Hall, under the Golden Staircase, under 200 rooms and 50 years of accumulated art and furniture and the material culture of a dynasty. And they mined it anyway. The first signs appeared in 1892. Hairline cracks in the plaster of the long gallery. Spiderweb patterns spreading across the ceiling like frost forming in reverse. The estate manager noted them in his weekly report. Routine settling, he called it. All old buildings shift. The palace was a century old. Some movement was expected. Natural. Nothing to concern His Grace about. But the cracks widened. By 1895, they were visible enough that guests commented. Dinner parties in the state dining room proceeded under ceilings mapping their own destruction in real time. You could watch them sometimes if you were patient, and the light was right. Tiny flakes of plaster, detaching and drifting down like snow, settling onto the mahogany table, onto the Sèvres plates, onto the shoulders of duchesses in Worth gowns, who brushed them away with practiced nonchalance because acknowledging structural failure was socially impossible. The sounds started next. Deep groans from beneath the floors, like the building was digesting itself. Guests staying overnight reported being woken by rumbling, distant thunder that seemed to originate from the earth itself, rolling up through the foundations and into the walls. At first, the family dismissed these as imagination, the kind of Gothic fantasies old buildings inspire in suggestible minds. But too many people heard them. Too many servants, too many visitors, too many people with no reason to lie or exaggerate. The palace was complaining. Engineers were summoned, inspections conducted. What they found was worse than cracks and noises. The eastern wing had subsided 4 inches. 4 inches doesn't sound catastrophic until you understand what it means in a building this size. 4 inches over a 100-foot span creates stress fractures that propagate through stone and mortar like fault lines through tectonic plates. Load-bearing walls become non-load-bearing. Arches designed to distribute weight evenly suddenly bear it unevenly, concentrating pressure on points never meant to sustain it. The engineers recommended immediate cessation of mining, not gradual reduction, immediate. Stop now, today, and pray the damage hasn't already passed the point of reversibility. Shore up the foundations with concrete piers sunk to bedrock. Install steel bracing throughout the affected wings. Budget for repairs in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. The Duke read the reports and ordered the mining to continue. This is where rational analysis breaks down. This is where we have to confront something uglier than greed, something closer to nihilism. He knew. The evidence was literally in his walls, cracking open, showing him in real time what mining coal from beneath a palace does to the palace. He could hear it at night, the groaning of tortured stone. He could see the cracks spreading like veins across ceilings his grandfather had commissioned. He had expert testimony, multiple engineers all saying the same thing in language too technical to misunderstand. And he kept mining. The royalties were too good. That's the simple answer. The coal seam was producing exactly as projected, and the money poured in. And the money paid for the upkeep, and the upkeep maintained appearances. And appearances were everything. To stop mining was to admit the palace was killing itself. To admit that was to admit the family had made a catastrophic error, had prioritized short-term income over long-term survival, had behaved like merchants instead of aristocrats. So they didn't admit it. They just kept extracting coal and pretending the building wasn't sinking. By 1900, the subsidence had reached 8 inches in some areas. The Great Hall's floor was no longer level. Balls still occurred there. Orchestras still played, but the musicians had to shim their chairs to keep instruments level. Dancers noticed the slope if they paid attention. The way waltzing in one direction felt subtly different than waltzing in another. Gravity's pull slightly altered by the tilt nobody would acknowledge. Doors stopped closing properly. Jambs that had been plumb for a century were now off by degrees enough that latches no longer caught. Servants wedged cloth into gaps to prevent drafts. The solution was adaptation, not repair, because repair would require stopping the cause, and the cause was paying for everything. The Beckford Library developed a lean. The bookshelves, installed plumb and level, now tilted perceptibly toward the eastern wall. Books slid slowly and less restrained. The glass-top display cases had to be adjusted, their contents carefully repositioned so illuminated manuscripts didn't migrate over weeks and months toward the low end of their prisons. Scholars visiting the library noted it in letters, the unsettling feeling of reading in a space that gravity had begun to reclaim. More engineers, more reports, more recommendations that started with immediate cessation and ended with estimates for emergency stabilization that now exceeded £500,000. £500,000 to maybe, possibly, save a building being deliberately undermined by its own owners. The 12th Duke, who inherited in 1895, considered the options with the kind of cold calculation that wealth allows. He could stop mining, spend £500,000 stabilizing, and lose the coal income that paid for operations. Or he could continue mining, accept accelerating damage, and delay the crisis until someone else had to solve it. He could kick the catastrophe down the road in exchange for a few more years of income and the appearance of normality. He chose the coal. Dinner parties continued. The season proceeded. London invitations were accepted and reciprocated. The palace lit up for balls and hunts, and the social theatre that justified its existence. Guests in the state bedrooms slept above voids where coal had been, above empty spaces growing larger and more numerous, honeycomb emptiness spreading under foundations that distributed weight, assuming solid ground beneath. Some guests knew. You couldn't spend time at Hamilton Palace without hearing the rumors, the whispered conversations about the mining, about the cracks, about the Duke's financial situation. But you didn't mention it. Social protocol demanded silence. Pointing out that your host was destroying his own palace to pay for your entertainment was unforgivably gauche. So everyone pretended. Everyone ignored the cracks and the tilts and the sounds, and participated in the collective delusion that this could continue indefinitely. The mining crews knew better. They worked in tunnels that ran directly under the ballroom, under the chapel, under bedrooms, where dukes slept uneasily. The miners could hear the palace sometimes, transmitted through rock and earth, the impact of footsteps during parties, the vibration of the organ during Sunday services. They worked beneath wealth they'd never see, extracting the foundation from under luxury they'd never experience. Tools in an act of destruction disguised as economics. Some refused to work those seams. Too dangerous, they said. Though the danger was to the palace above, not to them below. A kind of superstitious dread attached to the Hamilton seams. You were digging out the ground under a palace. That felt wrong in ways that transcended engineering and touched something older, some prohibition against literally undermining power. But there were always others willing to work. Unemployed men, desperate men. Men for whom the morality of coal extraction mattered less than wages and feeding families. The Duke found his miners, and the miners found the coal, and the coal became money, and the money paid for more balls and hunts and seasons, an Ouroboros of extraction and expenditure, consuming itself with systematic efficiency. By 1912, 20 years into the mining operation, the subsidence had reached 18 inches at its worst points. 18 inches. The eastern wing was noticeably lower than the western wing. Photographers could capture it, the palace's roofline no longer level, sagging like something alive and tired. The family stopped allowing certain photographs, controlled which angles journalists could shoot from, managed the visual evidence of collapse with the same energy they could have spent stopping the collapse. The technical absurdity of it became a joke in engineering circles. Hamilton Palace was a case study in what not to do, an example used in mining courses to illustrate the consequences of ignoring geology for finance. Students calculated the subsidence rates, predicted the failure points, wrote papers on the inevitable outcome. The Duke became a cautionary tale in technical literature, anonymized sometimes but recognizable to anyone who followed British aristocracy. And still the mining continued. The First World War provided convenient cover. Coal was patriotic. The nation needed fuel for the war effort. Hamilton coal-powered munitions factories, heated military barracks, fed the industrial machinery of total war. To stop mining was to betray the country, or so the argument went. Never mind that the mining predated the war by decades. Never mind that patriotism was a convenient excuse for economic dependence. The war made heroes of coal owners. And the Duke draped himself in that narrative while his palace subsided beneath him. By 1918, the Western Wing had begun to show symptoms. The subsidence was spreading, migrating through the foundation like a disease, no longer confined to the initial mining area, but propagating through the entire structure as stress redistributed and new weak points emerged. Cracks appeared in the golden staircase's balustrade. Gold leaf couldn't hide them, just made them more obscene. Fissures running through excess, the literal fracturing of ostentation. The family was trapped in a logic of their own making. They'd mined for decades, collected royalties, used that income to maintain a lifestyle that required the mining to continue. Stopping meant immediate financial crisis, but continuing meant inevitable structural crisis. There was no good option, only the choice between dying fast or dying slow. They chose slow. The post-war years brought new engineers, new reports, new recommendations, all saying the same thing with increasing urgency. The palace was beyond saving. Not beyond repair, but beyond affordable repair. The cost to stabilize and restore had ballooned to figures that exceeded the estate's total liquid assets. You'd have to sell everything to save the building, and if you sold everything, there'd be nothing left to put in the building, rendering the salvation pointless. The math had become theological. The palace existed to house wealth. The wealth existed because the palace gave it meaning, but maintaining the palace consumed the wealth, and generating wealth destroyed the palace. The contradiction couldn't be resolved, only endured, and endurance had a limit measured in inches of subsidence and the tensile strength of 100-year-old mortar. The 13th Duke inherited in 1919 and faced the equation cleanly. He couldn't afford to save the palace. He couldn't afford to maintain it. He couldn't afford to stop mining because mining was the only income source large enough to delay the inevitable. He was the heir to a dynasty built on accumulation, and his inheritance was a slow-motion catastrophe he couldn't stop, couldn't fix, couldn't escape. He kept mining for 2 more years. The coal seam was nearly exhausted anyway, the accessible reserves depleted, the remaining coal too deep or too dangerous to extract profitably. The mining stopped in 1921 not because anyone decided to save the palace, but because there was nothing left to take. By then, it was far too late. The palace had subsided 23 inches at its worst points. The eastern wing was visibly lower, its windows out of parallel with the horizon, its foundations sheared from bedrock. Interior walls had separated from exterior walls, gaps wide enough to see through in places. The chapel's floor had cracked, a fissure running altar to door like a verdict. The Beckford Library's shelves leaned at angles that made filing impossible. Books were removed, stored in outbuildings, the library becoming too dangerous to use, its contents evacuated like refugees from a war zone. Water infiltration began. The subsidence had created pathways, cracks in the foundation through which groundwater seeped. The lower floors flooded periodically, inches of standing water in rooms that had hosted royalty. The smell of dampened rot spread through the palace like infection. Servants reported mold in the staterooms, black blooms spreading across silk damask wallpaper, across the backs of paintings, across upholstery that had survived a century, only to succumb to moisture in a decade. The Duke commissioned one final assessment. The engineer spent 3 days measuring, calculating, documenting. His report was unequivocal. The palace was structurally unsound. It would continue to deteriorate regardless of intervention. The subsidence had created instabilities that would propagate for decades. Repairing it would cost more than building a new palace from scratch. His recommendation was clear: abandon the building. Salvage what can be saved. Accept the loss. The Duke read the report in his study in the palace he was being told to abandon, surrounded by the accumulated proof of 5 centuries of Hamilton power. Outside his window, the gardens stretched toward the horizon, maintained and perfect and utterly beside the point. He'd inherited a palace. He was about to preside over its execution. And it was his own family's fault. March 3rd, 1919. A notice appears in the Times. 11 lines. No sentiment. Hamilton Palace, unreserved sale of important art collection and furnishings. Christie's. As if 5 centuries of history were livestock being sent to slaughter. But the catalogue told a different story. 4 volumes, thick as Bibles, listing the contents of 200 rooms with clinical precision. Lot 1847, Cabinet, Rosewood and Ormolu, formerly the property of Marie Antoinette. Estimated value, £800. Christie's was trying to price the leftovers of a revolution, but the estimates were conservative. Word had spread through the collecting world like a rumor of death. Hamilton Palace was selling everything. Not duplicates, not the attic junk. The dynasty was liquidating its soul. Buyers arrived in Glasgow in private rail cars, mostly Americans. The war had drained Europe and filled American bank accounts with blood money. Men with names like Hearst, Rockefeller, and Frick. They had steel and oil, but they lacked one thing: history. And now they were here to buy it from aristocrats desperate enough to sell. This wasn't shopping. It was conquest by checkbook. The transfer of cultural capital from an exhausted empire to a new one. The Duke watched them arrive. He remained at the palace during the preparations, a decision observers found masochistic. He walked through rooms being emptied, watching strangers handle objects his family had touched for generations. The violation was intimate. These were his memories being processed like inventory. Day 1, 3,000 people packed the warehouse. The air was thick with cash and greed. The auctioneer opened with the paintings. Lot 1, a Titian, Madonna with Child, 1545. Opening bid, £5,000. The room held its breath. That was a decade of wages for a normal man. A hand rose. An American accent, 6,000. 7. The price climbed with obscene speed. Sold for £11,200. The hammer fell. 4 centuries of Italian craft and 100 years of Hamilton ownership vanished in a second, transferred to a museum in Boston whose name meant nothing to the man selling it. By lunch, 68 paintings had been sold. Total value, £240,000. The art of the Hamiltons was being redistributed to America, to continental museums, to private collectors whose names appeared in the records like tombstones. Then came the furniture. This is where the tragedy became visceral. Paintings are canvas. Furniture carries the marks of life. Lot 847, a Louis XIV escritoire. You could see the scratches where pens had dragged, ink stains from letters written by hands dead for 2 centuries, sold to an American dealer for £1,600. Within a week, it would be in a Fifth Avenue mansion, stripped of context, just another expensive antique, a trophy for new money. And then, Lot 1847, the Marie Antoinette cabinet. Even in a warehouse, it commanded silence. Rosewood so dark it absorbed the light. Gold mounts so fine you could see muscle fibers on miniature gods. It took 10 years to make in 1780. A master craftsman working while the French Revolution brewed outside his window. Opening bid, £800. A laugh from the crowd. Insulting. The price rocketed. 2,000. 3,000. Sold for £7,000 to William Randolph Hearst. £7,000 for a decade of a master's life. The mathematics were obscene. The cabinet ended up at Hearst Castle in California, set dressing for Hollywood parties, its tragic history reduced to a placard on the wall. Day 3. The masterpiece. Lot 2156. Rubens. Daniel in the Lion's Den. 8 feet by 12. A Baroque giant. One of the few works Rubens kept for himself until he died. The room tensed. This was the heavyweight fight. Opening bid, £20,000. Scottish museums tried to pool their money to keep it in the country. They dropped out at £25,000. They couldn't compete. It became American money against American money. 40,000. 45. 50. Sold for £65,000. The buyer. The Detroit Institute of Arts. Automobile money. Ford and Dodge fortunes transmuted into old masters. The painting was cut from its frame, rolled into a cylinder, and shipped under armed guard. Today, it hangs in Detroit, a copy of a European salon, witnessed by visitors who have no idea they are looking at stolen time. Day 7. The books. The Beckford Library. 20,000 volumes. Lot 3,847. The Gutenberg Bible. Printed in 1455. The foundation of modern knowledge. Sold for £28,000 to J.P. Morgan. The tool that democratized literacy was auctioned to the highest bidder to sit in a private vault. The library was dispersed in 4 days. 20,000 books scattered to 4 continents. The collection ceased to exist as a coherent entity. It became data points in foreign catalogues. As the sale dragged on, the stripping became literal. They didn't just sell the contents, they sold the building. The dining table that seated 84 sold to a local hotel for business lunches. The carpets woven by men who went blind creating them, cut into sections and sold by the square yard. And then, the autopsy began. Auction house staff started ripping architectural elements out of the walls. Marble fireplaces, carved in Italy, were pried loose with crowbars. The lead roofing was stripped and sold by the ton to scrap dealers. This was the death blow. Without the lead, the rain came in. Water streamed down the silk walls, warping the floors, accelerating the rot. The palace was dying from multiple wounds, subsidence from below, exposure from above, and hollowing from within. The sale ran for 16 days. Total realized just over £2 million. It sounds like a fortune, but the estate's debts consumed half of it immediately. The auction fees took the rest. The Duke received the accounting and learned the lesson of every dying aristocracy. Selling everything is never enough. The debts are always larger than the assets. The sale bought him a few more years of pretending, of paying wages for a staff that now dusted empty rooms. Hamilton Palace stood empty for the first time in history. A carcass, picked clean by vultures. The rooms echoed. The soul was gone. It was a corpse, dressed in architectural finery, waiting for the end. The demolition contract was awarded in 1921 to a Glasgow firm that specialized in industrial dismantling. Their usual work involved factories and warehouses, structures built for function rather than immortality. Hamilton Palace would test them. The engineers surveyed the building and reported back with numbers that seemed impossible. Walls 4 feet thick at the base, foundation stones weighing 8 tons each, marble staircases carved from single pieces of Italian stone. This wasn't a building designed to be demolished. This was architecture conceived as permanent, built with the assumption that time itself would bow to wealth and craftsmanship. They began with the interiors. What the auction hadn't taken, the wreckers destroyed. Remaining plasterwork, decorative moldings, the architectural details too integrated to sell separately. Crews with sledgehammers worked through rooms, reducing ornament to rubble. The sound echoed through empty halls, percussion without rhythm, destruction as industrial process. The gilded ceiling in the state dining room required special attention. Gold leaf doesn't shatter, it tears. Workers scraped it away, collected it for resale, the precious metal recycled into other applications, other objects, the Hamilton provenance lost in the smelting. What took months to apply took hours to remove. The ratio of creation to destruction played out in real time. Then came the marble. The grand staircase, 32 tons of gold leaf on stone, presented a problem. You can't simply knock down carved marble and expect to salvage anything. The material is too brittle, too prone to fracturing. The decision was made to bring the staircase down in sections, cutting through with diamond saws, separating the structure into manageable pieces. The sawing took weeks. Diamond blades screaming through stone, creating dust clouds that filled the palace's interior, coating everything in fine white powder. Workers wore masks, worked in shifts, the noise unbearable for extended periods. The staircase that aristocrats had ascended in silk and jewels was being murdered with industrial tools, reduced from architecture to inventory. Some pieces were sold to dealers specializing in architectural salvage. A balustrade section ended up in a London townhouse. A carved mewel post became a garden ornament in Surrey. The rest was broken further, crushed into aggregate, used as fill material in road construction. Hamilton Palace's golden staircase now forms part of the foundation of a Glasgow motorway, cars driving over what dukes once climbed. The inversion complete. The external walls proved more stubborn. Sandstone blocks, each one hand-cut and fitted, held together by lime mortar that had spent a century curing into something harder than the stone itself. Conventional demolition techniques failed. Sledgehammers bounced off. Manual labor would take years. They brought in explosives. Dynamite, placed strategically at load-bearing points, designed to drop sections of wall in controlled collapses. The first detonation occurred on a Tuesday morning, October 1921. The charge was calculated conservatively, engineers uncertain how the subsidence weakened structure would respond. The explosion was heard in Glasgow, 12 miles away. A dull thud, felt as much as heard, transmitted through earth still sensitive from decades of mining. The eastern wing's facade, 4 stories of sandstone and ambition, hung suspended for a moment, held by momentum and disbelief, then collapsed inward, folding like something organic, stone moving in ways stone shouldn't move. The dust cloud rose 200 feet, visible for miles, a brown-grey plume marking the palace's location like smoke from a battlefield. It took hours to settle. When it did, a quarter of the palace was rubble, just gone, reduced from architecture to geology in seconds. All that stone returning to the earth it had been quarried from a century prior. More explosions followed, each one calibrated based on lessons from the previous. The western wing came down in 3 separate detonations, the charges sequenced to prevent uncontrolled collapse. Even ruined, even condemned, Hamilton Palace demanded respect. The engineering required to destroy it safely approached the complexity of its original construction. The Great Hall resisted longest. Those 4-foot-thick walls, that black marble, the sheer density of material. Explosives alone weren't enough. They brought in a wrecking ball, a 2-ton steel sphere suspended from a crane, swung repeatedly into walls until the stone fractured, until the mortar gave up, until physics finally overcame craftsmanship. The sound of the wrecking ball hitting marble echoed across Lanarkshire, a bell tolling its own destruction. Workers reported feeling sick, physically ill from the vibrations, the bass frequency impacts traveling through ground and air, felt in chests and stomachs. Demolition is visceral experience. It took 11 months to bring the palace down completely. 11 months of explosions and machinery, of dust and noise and systematic erasure. By October 1922, nothing remained above ground except rubble fields and the Hamilton Mausoleum. The mausoleum had been built separately, 200 yards from the palace, constructed in the 1850s as the family's final monument. Domed, neoclassical, it was designed to house ducal remains in perpetuity, a statement that some things at least would outlast mortality. It survived the demolition untouched, the contract explicitly excluding it, heritage law protecting burial grounds even when everything else was expendable. It stands today, alone in a landscape emptied of context, the only vertical element in fields that should frame a palace but frame nothing. Visitors find it eerie. The mausoleum was designed to be approached through palace grounds, to be seen as extension of domestic architecture into death. Isolated, it becomes something else, a monument to absence, a gravestone for a building. The interior creates acoustic phenomena. The dome generates echoes that repeat 15 times, each repetition distinct, your voice bouncing back from marble surfaces in waves that last 30 seconds. They call it the whispering wall. Speak at one side of the chamber and someone at the opposite side hears you clearly, while people between hear nothing. The acoustics were unintentional, a quirk of geometry, but they've become the mausoleum's identity, the thing people know about Hamilton when they know nothing else. The dukes rest there still, in lead coffins stacked in the crypt, their bodies preserved against decay by wealth, even after the wealth destroyed their palace. You can visit. The mausoleum is maintained, stabilized, open for tours. People walk through and wonder at the echoes, take photographs, leave without knowing what they're missing, what used to surround this structure, what was deliberately erased from landscape and memory. But was it really the coal, the subsidence, the mining, the structural failure, all of it documented, all of it provable? The engineering reports exist. The photographs show the cracks. The timeline is clear. Mining began in 1882, damage appeared by 1892, became catastrophic by 1920, cause and effect rendered in stone and physics. And yet, questions persist. Theories proliferate in the gaps between facts. The timing troubles some researchers. World War I ended in 1918. The sale happened in 1919. The demolition began in 1921. This was the period when Britain's aristocracy was being systematically dismantled, not by revolution, but by taxation and death duties and economic forces that accomplished what guillotines had in France. Thousands of estates were broken up. Hundreds of country houses were demolished or abandoned. Hamilton Palace was exceptional in scale but not in fate. The taxes hit the aristocracy like a second war. Death duties introduced in 1894 at 8%, increased to 40% by 1919, eventually reaching 80% by mid-century. Inheriting an estate meant inheriting a tax bill that could only be paid by selling the estate. The logic was intentional, policy designed to redistribute accumulated wealth to break the landed gentry's grip on capital and culture. Hamilton Palace's demolition coincided exactly with this aristocratic collapse. The subsidence was real, but it was also convenient. It provided cover, a natural explanation for what might otherwise look like forced liquidation under economic pressure. Saying the palace was structurally unsound sounds better than admitting you can't afford the taxes. Some researchers point to comparable estates that survived worse damage. Castle Howard suffered a catastrophic fire in 1940, lost its central dome, remained structurally compromised for decades. It was repaired. Chatsworth House experienced significant subsidence from mining in the 19th century. It was stabilized. The technology existed, the engineering was available. Hamilton Palace could have been saved if saving it had been economically viable, but it wasn't. That's the truth beneath the theories. The palace died from multiple causes: subsidence and debt, and taxation and changing social orders all conspiring together. Trying to isolate a single cause misses the point. This was systemic failure. The entire structure of aristocratic wealth, the assumption that estates would persist indefinitely, that heritage mattered more than economics, all of it collapsed in the early 20th century. Hamilton Palace was just the most visible casualty. The demolition rubble was supposed to be cleared, The contract specified complete removal, the site returned to agricultural use. But clearing took longer than anticipated. The sheer volume of material, thousands of tons of stone and marble and brick, exceeded the contractor's capacity. Some was used as fill for road construction, some was buried on site. Much of it simply remained, pushed into piles, gradually covered by soil and vegetation. Beneath the grass today lie the palace's bones, foundation stones too large to move economically, sections of wall that toppled into basement levels and were simply covered over. The wine cellars, intact but sealed, their contents unknown, possibly still holding bottles from before the demolition. Ground-penetrating radar surveys show massive anomalies, regular geometric patterns indicating structural remains at various depths. Nobody excavates. The land is privately owned, agricultural lease, the owners uninterested in archaeology or heritage tourism. The past stays buried, literally, beneath crops and sheep, and the slow accumulation of soil that eventually covers everything. But knowledge persists. The photographs survive in archives. The auction catalogues exist in libraries. The engineering reports sleep in county record offices, available to researchers willing to look. Hamilton Palace remains accessible, not physically but documentarily, its existence provable through paper and image, even as its physical form dissolves into landscape. This is how history works now, not through preservation but through documentation. The palace is gone, but its ghost is thoroughly recorded, mapped, described, analyzed. Future generations will know exactly what was lost, will be able to calculate its value, measure its scale, understand its significance. They just won't be able to visit, won't be able to walk the halls or climb the staircase, or stand in the Great Hall and feel the cold marble's intimidation. Is that enough? Does documentation substitute for presence? Can history survive as information alone, divorced from place and material reality? Hamilton Palace suggests not. The building mattered because it existed, because you could touch it, because its scale and excess were experiential, overwhelming, impossible to fully grasp from photographs or descriptions. The difference between seeing an image of the golden staircase and climbing it, between reading about the Great Hall and standing in it, that difference is everything. That's what was lost. Not information, but experience. Not knowledge, but encounter. And it was lost deliberately. That's what haunts this story. This wasn't earthquake or fire or accidental destruction. Every step was intentional. The mining, the sale, the demolition, all of it chosen, calculated, executed with full knowledge of consequences. The Hamilton family and their advisors and the government officials who approved the demolition, all of them knew they were erasing something irreplaceable. They did it anyway, because economics demanded it, because social change required it, because the alternative was preserving a monument to inequality while the nation struggled with post-war recovery and depression. Hamilton Palace was obscene in its excess. In 1921, while miners lived in company housing and factory workers crowded into tenements, the idea of spending millions to preserve a duke's palace was politically impossible. So it came down. And in coming down, it took with it not just architecture, but a way of life, an entire social order's material culture. The palace was the physical manifestation of aristocratic power, the proof that some families were fundamentally different, occupied different reality than common people. Destroying it was destroying that claim. Making it equal with the ground was making the duke equal with his miners. There's justice in that. Hard, cold, geological justice. The same earth that gave the coal that funded the palace's maintenance ultimately reclaimed the palace itself. Carbon extracted, converted to currency, transformed into architecture, then demolished and returned to earth, the cycle complete. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, but also marble to rubble, gold to scrap, dynasty to memory. Other palaces stand. Blenheim, Castle Howard, Chatsworth, dozens of ducal residences survived the 20th century, transitioned to heritage sites and tourist attractions, their owners adapting to reduced circumstances and altered social contracts. Hamilton Palace could have joined them. The difference was timing, luck, and the fatal decision to mine beneath the foundations. But perhaps it's appropriate that Hamilton is gone while others remain. Its absence teaches what presence cannot. Loss instructs in ways preservation doesn't. Every visitor to Blenheim takes its existence for granted, assumes such buildings naturally survive. Hamilton Palace's erasure proves otherwise. proves that nothing is permanent, that even stone this thick and wealth this concentrated can vanish, that history is fragile, and continuation requires active choice, generation after generation, to value preservation over profit. The grass grows where gods once walked. That sentence opened this story, returns us now to the field, the present tense, the reality of absence. Stand there today, and you'd never know. The landscape has healed over the wound. Nature doesn't mourn. Sheep graze without consciousness of what lies beneath their hooves. Rain falls on ground that once supported 200 rooms and doesn't care. But we know. We have the capacity for knowledge that transcends experience, for understanding absence through evidence, for reconstructing the lost through fragments and testimony. Hamilton Palace exists in collective memory, in archives, in the dispersed collection now scattered across 3 continents, in the stories told and retold about a building so grand it seemed impossible to destroy. And yet, beneath the grass, the foundations wait, stone laid by masons who believed they were building for eternity, cellars that held wine and coal, and the material provisions for a dynasty that expected no ending. The palace is gone, but its anchor remains, invisible, undisturbed, slowly settling deeper into earth softened by the very mining that doomed it. What else waits beneath surfaces we think we know? What other histories have been deliberately covered, erased, forgotten? Hamilton Palace was documented, its destruction recorded, its absence explainable. But how many other structures, other stories, other entire civilizations have been systematically removed from landscape and memory? The question spirals outward. If a building this significant, this documented, this central to a nation's aristocratic identity can be erased in a generation, what else has been erased that we don't even know to look for? What lies beneath other fields, other cities, other landscapes that seem natural but might be manufactured absence? Stand in that Lanarkshire field at dusk, when light softens and the mind becomes suggestible, and you can almost see it, the palace rising from grass like a memory becoming solid, the dome catching last light, windows glowing from within as if the past is leaking through temporal cracks. Then you blink, and it's gone. Just grass, just sheep, just ordinary Scottish countryside under ordinary sky. But the earth remembers. In the subsidence that continues even now, a millimetre per year, barely measurable but persistent. In the foundation stones that radar detects, but nobody excavates. In the mausoleum standing watch over emptiness, its whispers echoing through marble chambers, speaking to no one, preserving sound in the absence of meaning. $10 billion in rubble lies beneath your feet, waiting, not for resurrection, but for recognition, for the acknowledgement that value and permanence are different things, that wealth cannot purchase survival, that even palaces bow to physics and economics and time's patient work. The grass grows, the stones settle, the story survives. That's all that remains. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the tale of Hamilton Palace matters more than the palace itself, the lesson more valuable than the building. We learn from loss what survival cannot teach. We understand fragility by witnessing collapse. We appreciate preservation by mourning erasure. Hamilton Palace is gone. But its ghost walks, speaks, teaches, and beneath the grass and the cold, dark earth, the foundations endure, testament to the hubris of building for eternity, in a universe that recognizes only change. Listen carefully, and you might hear it. The echo of footsteps in halls that no longer exist. The whisper of silk on phantom stairs. The rumble of machinery extracting coal from beneath a palace that paid for its own destruction. The earth keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you know where to look and what to listen for, it confesses.